Brands on Brands.
Hey, what's up, everyone? This week we talked to Sandra Chau about visual storytelling and visual branding. Check it out.
In a world where content is king and your reputation is your brand, how do you build a brand that matters? Welcome to Brands on Brands, a home for those that think different and push their boundaries. This is where branding that matters lives. Now, here is your host, Brandon Birkmeyer.
Hey, what's up? Welcome to Brands on Brands. I'm Brandon Birkmeyer, your personal branding coach, and today is an interview episode. Today we are talking with Sandra Chau. She's a stylist and creative director, and she's known and respected for her minimalist design aesthetic. And if you want to check that out, you can go to Sandra Chau Design on Instagram. She takes a thoughtful and intentional approach to design and connects brands to their customers by elevating their visuals in new and exciting ways. She founded the School of Visual Branding in 2018 and specializes in teaching entrepreneurs how to grow their online brands and increase their profit using visual strategy. All of our conversations today are focused on those concepts of visual branding, visual storytelling, and the strategies to help you get there. And if you guys are interested in checking out her course, it's called the Branding Shoot Method. That's at the schoolofvisualbranding.com. Otherwise, everything's at sandrachau.com. That's Sandra, Sandra, Chau, chow.com. Otherwise, I really enjoyed our conversation. It got me thinking more visually about my brand, what I could do to bring interest into the content I create. And not just on my website, but everything in terms of social media and even TikToks we talk about today. So really interesting conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did. And let's jump into the show.
Brands on Brands.
All right, let's get going. And today I'm excited to welcome our guest, Sandra Chau, to the show. Sandra, first and foremost, thanks for being here.
No, thanks so much for having me, Brendan.
Absolutely. The reason I'm excited today is that we get to talk a little bit more creatively about that side of the world, which for me, I was on the media side, right? And there was always like the creative side as well. So those are things I like to tap into because I feel like I'm learning along the way as well. And your specialty, visual branding, visual storytelling, is the topic of conversation today. So maybe you, as the expert in that, can help us set the stage a little bit. How do you think about or define visual branding for the people out there listening? And why does that matter?
Yeah, no, so I mean, think about it this way. Visual branding, it's really essentially the visual representation of your brand. And it consists like all the different visual elements that represent your brand. So, ranging from like your logo to your fonts, to your colors, to the designs, your images, your videos, even down to things like your graphics and your brand collateral, anything that you use, to actually sell for your business. And the thing about visual branding and why I think it's really important, it's really, when you're thinking about how to pull all those different pieces together to create that overall brand. Because, a brand's not just a logo, it's not just your images, it's all of those, different pieces, learning how to bring them together strategically and sort of in that kind of cohesive way, that look and feel that really builds that know, like, and trust in your brand. And, I'm sure Brandon, the know, like, and trust factor is essentially ultimately that thing that, gets people to book you or to buy from you. So it's that overall picture for your brand.
Yeah, I think that that's helpful. I think for us, who don't do this every day professionally, the first thought is like what people see, and so we're like website, logo. But beyond that, there's a million places we have to be these days, websites, social media. How do you get people to find, you said cohesive, how do you get people to find a cohesive feel when there are so many places we have to be visually these days?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main things that I typically do for my clients and also teach with my students is really asking them, with everything that you put out there, ask yourself, I mean, I guess first of all, ask yourself a very simple question like, how do you want your brand to feel to your audience or to your clients and customers? Like, what's that one word or one adjective that you use to describe? It could be something like, very positive or like, vibrant, or it could be, warming or, comforting, anything like that. And then what I usually do is anchor my brand or like my other, my other clients' brands to those kinds of adjectives that describe the brand. And then everything that you put out there, you kind of refer back to it and ask yourself, does this kind of represent, like, does this feel on brand to you? And a lot of the times it's like that simple gut check that, or if you're feeling like, oh, something kind of feels a little bit out of place, or there's something a little bit off about this image, or where I'm placing this text. If there's something feels a little bit off about it, usually I say chances are it's probably either not on brand, or you want to tweak it so that it kind of visually speaks for your brand a little bit more. And I think especially when you're talking about like cohesion, a lot of the times it's whether it's like your brand voice and the actual identity, similar to when you're thinking about like if you were developing your brand identity and you're looking at your logo and your colors and the fonts and how that all works together. There's usually that kind of theme around it, that overall theme. And I like to use that to think about all the other things in my brand. So like you said just now, there's a lot of things about like your website, and you think about like your images, but what else is there? If you think about someone coming in through your socials, where do they click off to after that? They go to your website. If say you're a coach, or you're any kind of service-based business, the next thing is them booking a call. And let's say that you show up to a call, you want your personality to feel very similar to your persona online. And then what happens there? Usually you might send like a client proposal, and that client proposal, if you can add like other visual elements to it, or think about your personality, that kind of all follows on through. Like, you can't just stop at when the lead comes in, and then you got to think about all those other visual elements. And it might be like your proposal, which seemingly might not seem visual, but it is actually another visual piece of the puzzle. And then it kind of follows on from that. Or if perhaps you like your graphics and how you promote and push something, all of that, you kind of want that cohesive line through. So when people go through all those different customer touch points, they know it's the same person. And, there are times where, I'll see someone like see a really cool reel, or see like a really cool image on Instagram. And then, how you click through to the website and you're like, oh, actually, it seems a little bit, is it the same brand? When you kind of have those questions, that's when you're not really cohesive, right? Where, you sort of start losing that know, like, and trust factor, because people are like, hang on, is this the same brand that I saw? Or, is the quality of that t-shirt that I was just clicking through to see, like, is it actually, worth, $200? Or, oh, this person that I wanted to work with, hang on, this website actually looks a little bit not legit. It doesn't seem as professional as what you saw on Instagram, So it's really thinking about all that follow through, that entire kind of branding, which, yeah, is something that I think gets missed a lot sometimes.
Yeah. I'm thinking of this like for people who are doing a lot of content like I'm doing. What I've seen is they'll have like an introduction, right, to a podcast or something like that. That's very, like there's a different voice, it's an announcer or something, and it's very aggressive and manly. And then the music's hard hitting rock, right? And then the host will jump on the show and they're very soft spoken. And there's a disconnect between the
Absolutely.
two things. Maybe that's what the vibe that they wanted, but their personality didn't seem to match the vibe they were building. So I think of that audio, in audio. I also think about that with content, like where you're like, you find a show and it's about marketing like this one is, but then if I am spending a whole episode about travel, that's a disconnect, right?
Absolutely.
So visually, I could, where do you see some disconnects that happen often? That's, they see one thing, but it doesn't deliver visually.
Yeah, I think so. Using that example, like if we're on Instagram, or wherever some people first kind of spot you, where you spend a lot of your time engaging with people, what I see is sometimes with, let's say now at the moment, Instagram reels are like a huge thing, right? Let's say you created these reels, they're really cool, they even potentially go viral, and then what happens usually after that? So if you think about the way I like to think about it, how I would approach someone's brand, if I went from like finding them to actually then going to book them, right? If I sort of think about that journey, for me, I'll go from like Instagram and I'm like, okay, that's really cool. Or I really like what they had to say. They really seem to know their stuff, and then you kind of like, okay, I'm going to go click onto their website, see what their services are, or like, what do they offer? There are a lot of times where I will do that, and then the website is actually maybe like in a holding kind of page, or there's not much there, or visually speaking, compared to what I've seen on a visual platform like Instagram or even something like Pinterest, the visuals are kind of like maybe a little bit too DIY, or they're not as elevated and professional as what you've seen elsewhere. And then, like, even visually speaking, when we're talking about like your logo or like your fonts and your colors, how that all pieces together, sometimes, maybe they've used a font that, their brand, let's say, is really mature and powerful. But then the font that they've chosen is like more cutesy, those kind of, like, people don't think about those elements as being visual. Sometimes a lot of people usually jump straight to like, oh, it's my image or it's my video. But when you're talking about the, overall visual branding, it's all those little pieces that, like you said before, that you can see with your eyes, how they piece together. It can create a whole different vibe. Like something as simple as using cutesy font will change the entire vibe of like your brand, from something that's more mature and elevated to something that's a little bit like, oh, okay, it's quite maybe young in their brand, or a little less sort of at that expert level that you were expecting when you kind of jumped off the other platform. That's why I was saying, like, making sure those points sort of connect and move across all your different potential areas where people can come in and find you, because there's so many different ways that people can find you usually, because you have to be in all the places almost. And it's really easy to put all your eggs in one basket and focus on that, but not think about like, okay, what happens next? Like, what happens when people fall in love with your persona or fall in love with what they've seen on one platform? What happens when they go to all the other ones? Like, is it going to be the same? Or are people going to be like, oh, actually, okay, this is not what I was expecting or not what I was thinking? And then they kind of jump off and it doesn't really convert.
Yeah, I think this is good because I think we're painting a picture of what it means to be consistent and what, when you're doing this right, what it feels like versus wrong. I'd like to get into this idea of, like doing something well, because we talk about quality a little bit. Does it have to be clean and beautiful to be strong visually?
No, I don't think it has to be clean and beautiful. My biggest thing is, a pretty picture is not really going to do anything for your brand unless it actually communicates, your value. So, and every brand is different. You could have two coaches, and one coach is, their brand is more vibrant and boppy and outgoing, but then you could have another business coach whose brand is more, let's just say, maybe their attitudes are like more mature, or more down to earth. And that would naturally inform, what kind of logo your logo might look like, or what kind of fonts you might use, or the colors would be absolutely different. Something that's vibrant and happy, I would expect, bright colors, but then something that's a little bit more mature, I would expect, maybe more toned down kind of colors, or maybe touches of black or something like that. So yeah, I don't think it has to be clean. The thing I do think, though, it's really about how you pair all of that together to make it, overall something that's professional, something that people can actually trust, is that thing. I think it's the sort of that trust factor, in that, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this idea of following through when we were a little earlier. And what are some of the kind of steps we can take to make sure we are following through from one place to another, that we're not missing those steps? How do we kind of check to make sure that we're not missing one of these boxes?
Yeah, I mean, I like to ask myself, like, does it feel on brand? Aesthetically, does it feel on brand? And then in terms of like voice, is it on brand? Everything that, we talked about, making sure that it sort of crosses over and overlaps with everything. And what I like to do is I like to do sort of like a helicopter view of your brand, thinking about all the different aspects, all the different places that people find you. So, it might be, for you, for example, people might find you on Instagram, they might find you on Apple Podcasts, they might find you on, just through Google search, they might find you perhaps through Pinterest or anything like that. And then think about that customer journey, all the different touch points, and you go through each of them and ask yourself, like, does this actually look like the other one? Are you using the similar kind of branding, or like your colors and fonts? Are those kind of weaved in throughout? does it actually feel like your brand? And then a lot of the times when it doesn't, it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. It's actually quite easy to see that, oh, okay, I forgot to update my website after I went through this change. And I think, as entrepreneurs, you do go through change so much. You evolve and change your brand a lot, whether it's I mean, not necessarily in the actual branding, but whether it's in the content or as you grow and evolve, maybe your brand changes a little bit in its tone, things like that. And sometimes we remember to, change, your website, but then you forget to change like, oh, the graphics that you might use on, Pinterest, Instagram, wherever, to actually follow on and actually support that as well too. So a lot of the times it's just asking yourself, like, does this kind of feel on brand?
Yeah. And I think that's probably where people start to reach out to someone like you, because I think a lot of us, that gets to be the hard part when you're like, well, it's supposed to feel a certain way. And how do I know if I'm doing this right or not? Then we might need to reach out to someone who kind of understands how to pull that out of us as business owners, as coaches, as consultants, as service-based professionals, whatever it might be. So I would like to dive into those tactics a little bit of the process of where to get started in terms of, if you're helping someone, how do you start to help them find the right feeling, the right brand for them? You mentioned the one word approach, but like, give us some actual like day in the life. How do you help people go on this journey who it's not natural for them?
Yeah, I mean, the adjective exercise that I said before is ultimately the starting point that I use with my clients all the time. I always ask them, how do you want your brand to be perceived? How do you want, your customers to feel when they land on your website? How do you want them to feel when, they interact with you on, like, say, DMs or in your socials, anything like that? And like I said before, if you're talking about a business coach, some people might be, I want them to feel nurtured, and that would automatically determine a kind of a different vibe versus someone who's like, I want them to feel empowered. It's a very different kind of adjective. And so I always pull that first and then think about, okay, so then if we look at your branding and logo, a lot of the times, I have students who come through my course and they'll be like, well, I actually, in that particular example, I want them to feel, empowered and alive. But then their branding is nothing like that. It's, like I said, a stark contrast, and it's might be something that's, very cutesy. It's very bubbly, in the writing or anything like that. And then they'll usually think like, oh, okay, so maybe I need to change my logo or the colors and fonts that I use already. And then from that next step, when we're talking about your images, things that support your messaging, things, that visual, because sort of that visual representation of your copy is a good way to put it, I think. And ask yourself, like, okay, if we want people to feel empowered, if we want people to feel, that kind of like alive when they work with you as a business coach, what are some things that you might be able to use to represent that? And you can even use things like stock images. Stock images these days has quite a lot of moodier type of images, and it might speak to that. Okay, before you work with a business coach, you're feeling a little bit lost and overwhelmed. So if we're looking at like a sales page, for example, maybe you start with images when you're talking about like, oh, does this feel like you, or is this you? And the images are someone who's maybe like thinking or, kind of brooding or looking a bit overwhelmed. And then it kind of moves through that journey of, okay, so if we work together, this is how you're going to feel, that transformation. And you're thinking about, maybe images that people are looking more alive, looking very empowered. And it's like lights and, sunlight and that kind of positivity, and again, it goes back to those adjectives that I said before, always anchoring your brand to it. Like that is the ultimate thing, and is actually the crux of everything. That when I work with my clients and my students, I always ask them about that, and they follow that through to all the different points, down to actually like creating a video, for example. If you wanted to create a video for your reel and your brand is all about, positivity and empowerment and stuff, then that kind of informs that vibe that you're going for as well too. And so it all kind of, ties in that sense. I mean, I'd love to flesh that out a bit more, if you'd like. But yeah.
We can definitely go down that road even further. I think what I would imagine is I'm going to start saying there's words that like, yeah, both. Empowered, absolutely. Like nurtured, sure. Like there's going to be words that I'm like, yeah, I want all those things, but they might be at odds visually. But to me, they all seem to fit. So I wonder, how do I even decide when they all seem like the right words? But how do I know when the right words are the right brand? You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong sort of adjective to choose, and everyone's interpretation is slightly different. So the key thing is making sure, like, if you interpret, if you're pairing nurturing with empowering, with alive, those kinds of adjectives together, and your branding is one that's a little bit more neutral, so it's about making sure that's working for your brand ties throughout. So there's really no right or wrong way. I mean, as with branding, you can't tell somebody this is going to be your brand. It's a very personal thing. So the key thing is more of making sure that what you've chosen kind of moves throughout. And a lot of the times, like, just because you've chosen something that's nurturing and empowering, it doesn't mean, like, let's say color wise, that it wouldn't sort of match up. Nurturing and empowering, people kind of, what's the word? They kind of use different colors to represent it, but ultimately you're still going to have that brand identity that you've chosen based on that. And it's about making sure you're consistent with that and not changing throughout. So whatever it means for you, that's fine. And I think the main thing is making sure that channels throughout. And a lot of the times, if you're working with a brand designer and they always ask you, what kind of adjectives or what's a brand personality or anything like that, and you'll usually have a few words to describe it. The thing that I think confuses a lot of people is they think everything that they put out there has to, maybe touch on all five of them or all four of them. But I think the key for consistency is, as long as you can actually, say that one of those words are kind of in the thing that you put out there to the world, whether it's your website, whether it's, your images or videos or anything like that, that already brings that consistency, because you're not deviating from those adjectives per se, but you're making sure that at least one or two of them are involved in whatever it is that you're putting out there. So for me, for example, my brand is, I use the words like, calm, to describe it, light, warm, but I won't always, like, everything I put out there isn't always like light filled or isn't always, bright or anything like that. But ultimately though, I use the word calm. So if you actually look at, visuals that I've done for my clients, or if you look at sometimes, graphics that I do for myself, or in my images, like the stories that I tell, the images that I select from them, those quiet moments, there's always that element of quiet in them, no matter whether I work for a brand that's very vibrant or whether I work for a brand that's very kind of muted or moody or anything like that. So for me, I do have this collection of adjectives, but I just try to make sure like one of them is always in throughout my work. And then as you sort of build your brand out, all those come together. And I think if you can make sure there's that consistency in that one or two that you like to use, then that will sort of flow throughout. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that helps. I think what's coming to mind for me is, I'm understanding the concept of finding a few words. And I know for me, I do the same. If I help people start a show or something like that, I'm like, why don't you look at some things that you like and share that with me? Like, send me, like, for anyone, like, send me examples of the things that resonate with you. Cause usually we like things that we want to emulate or that, are aligned with us. And I think that's easy for people. Sometimes, like, just saying, what are the things that you really like out there? And then you're like, okay, well, now we've whittled it down to a group of things. We found the neighborhood that we're in now. Let's get down to the actual section of that neighborhood. Definitely helps.
Yeah. And I think, like, with that example that you're saying there, it's true. Like, you and I could have the same business, and you and I could be looking at, let's just say, the same image or the same piece of marketing material, but we probably both like it for different reasons. And so that's kind of what I was saying before. Like, if your adjectives are similar to someone else's brand, that doesn't actually necessarily mean that your brand's going to look like somebody else. Because what draws us to particular aspects is always going to be different. And so that's kind of, knowing what you love and knowing what you don't like, is that key to making you stand out from, like, someone else who's doing something very similar to you. And that's the thing. Like, I think sometimes we, look at two images and then think like, okay, well, my competitor probably likes the same thing about it. But ultimately it's probably not the case. Like, someone might like, the composition of it, or someone might like, the action that's in the in the image, or like the video, for example. So there's that kind of point of difference, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when I see lots of people that I like, but some I'm like, well, if I had to pick one that I want to be like it there, and that becomes different too. And then I can kind of emulate that and then take the things that I like the best out of it. But it gets complicated. There's so much content we have out there these days. It's not just a website anymore. It's literally, it's content everywhere in all different formats.
Yeah.
In some cases, it may not feel like there's any branding at all because it's not branding how we think about it. There may not be, like a frame or some kind of graphic element. Even sometimes it's just you, the human, on the screen half the time, especially with where TikTok's going these days. Like, literally it's just video of you in some environment. So how do you control for creating branding elements when all you have is the person and the environment they're in?
Yeah. And that's true, because like these days your brand is not just a logo anymore, right? I think traditionally you kind of think like, okay, my brand is my logo. But like I was saying before, it's the kind of that overall brand. And so for something like, TikTok and Instagram Reels, where, like you said, it really is just you. There are still a lot of ways to make sure that it's on brand for you, putting aside like the personality of the brand, like, how you interact on the video and whatnot. But if you think about, like, people don't necessarily think about it, but if you think about like how you dress, that kind of informs a different vibe, right? Or it could be, like you said, the environment. I mean, some people might do it outdoors, but you've seen some people who do it in their studio, or with their things that are seemingly not part of your brand but are probably like on brand, which form the brand. So it's those kind of little things that I think make the difference and create that consistency, even on something like Instagram Reels or TikTok, that forms the brand and creates that kind of cohesiveness. You'll see a lot of on TikTok and on Reels, a lot of people who are doing it really well, that it's very consistent, even on something like video, the way that they show up, whether it's in the background, whether it's in the style that they show up. And I think for me personally, like, my brand is very, like, I'm not an influencer. I don't. So I'm, for me personally, like, this is an example where, thinking about your brand and how you show up and how that kind of informs your overall brand. Like, for me, if I started showing up on Instagram Reels and singing and pointing, I can guarantee you that my audience will be like, oh my God, what is Sandra doing? Like, that feels so, like, it's so off brand for me, that for when I do Reels, I still try to think of ways that would still make sense for my brand, so that it's not, doesn't really stick out like a sore thumb, and I'm still attracting the kind of people that I want to attract, so when you're thinking about video content now, which is, the big thing at the moment, you still want to think about, like, okay, does this feel like me? Does this feel like my brand? If then someone comes and, books a call with me, a discovery call with me, are they going to be like, oh, okay, this is a completely different person that I was sort of following on TikTok, And again, it's that consistency, and not sort of jumping on the trend in the way, I mean, I guess blindly jumping on a trend is probably a good way to put it. Is a really good way to make sure that everything is kind of cohesive, not just doing what works for somebody else or what you think will work. Still bringing it back to, like, your branding foundations. Thinking about how you want to show up, the personality that you want to give off, the voice. All of that is more important than just jumping on that next trend, because you've got to think about, like, what happens after that. What happens after your TikTok goes viral and someone wants to speak with you? Like, what happens after that? And I think that's the thing that that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that I see with a lot of people these days is, putting your eggs all in one basket in the thing that's trending at the moment, but not thinking about, okay, what happens next? And what happens in those other areas of your branding that people are going to come across after that.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. Because I mean, if I got popular because me and my family did a cute Christmas dance this past season, that would have gotten a lot of views, but it wouldn't. Once they went deeper into my videos, you'd be like, oh, every other video is business content. I wanted more Christmas tree
Yeah,
dance videos. Like it's a wasted viral trend at that point. And I think so much is environment these days. You mentioned obviously how we dress and present ourselves, but also the environment we put ourselves in. There's even if you are an entertainer, a dancer, whatever it is, like I have recognizable images in my head of like this influencer is always street dancing on, in like Times Square. And this person is always in their bathroom doing karaoke. And this person's always doing the best dance moves, but like in their bedroom,
absolutely.
and it's messy, but that's them. So
Yeah.
there are associations connected and they fit the environment. But if you get professional with it, those environments work too. Like I've seen like one of like Donald Miller's one of the guys I follow. He wrote the book Story Brand.
Yeah.
He's definitely not, a teenager. He's not dancing, but he does have videos that he puts out there and he's sitting on his front porch, which is the more kind of mature vibe. And he's giving, like shorter clips of advice that play into his longer, like mentor, coach type story, thought leadership, that kind of thing. So I think, environment could and should match. If he was giving me that same advice from his like laundry room, it just wouldn't feel like the same.
Yeah, it wouldn't. And I think the thing is when you're, because we're in such like a scroll kind of stage, of our lives at the moment, you don't really think about it until you actually break it down. Like you said, Donald Miller is a fantastic example because if he started like singing and dancing and pointing and words popping up, because that's also seemingly the thing at the moment, it would seem a little bit off. It would seem a little bit probably too childish for his mature brand. And like you said, like if he started showing up in his laundry or, cooking, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it doesn't work for his brand, but people don't necessarily think like, oh, okay, those small, intentional, conscious decisions actually, inform a part of like how your brand is showing up, the way that your brand is perceived on that platform. And then, it still matches everything else. Like it still matches the tone of his book or when you go to his website or if you speak to him on the podcast, all of that. It still has that follow through, even though he's dived into a completely, new type of, content creation as well too. And I think it's about finding, making it work for you, not the other way around, is ultimately the thing, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you mentioned cooking, and I was like, yeah, I'm like, I wouldn't hate it if he had a cooking video, but also that's not like why I tuned into him. So like, I might discover someone because of that first video, but it goes
Yeah.
like now if I'm a loyal subscriber and I'm always checking in on what he's doing, I may not mind it behind the scenes, but that's not why I tuned into him. I don't tune into him to become a better cook.
Yeah.
So it might be interesting for a minute, but it's not exactly why I'm tuning in personally to that brand.
Yeah, it would seem a little odd, I think. But I mean, again, nothing
Yeah.
wrong with that. Then if you're like a brand that sold, I mean, if you're like a cooking brand, or I mean, that's obviously a like no brainer. But if you're a brand that, is more of a lifestyle brand, that would probably work, here and there. Like you could probably weave it in throughout. But, for someone like him, it would kind of seem a little out of place. And it might, like you said, make you stop for a minute, think about it. But then if you kept showing up like that, there probably would start having that kind of disconnect.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about how do you create more variety then? So let's say you've kind of figured out your thing. You have a sense of your identity and your adjectives, and you're looking to kind of shake it up a little bit because we can go the complete opposite extreme and be too similar and not enough kind of, excitement being brought into our world of content. How do you bring some variety into the brand storytelling, visual branding process?
I think one of the things that I like to do personally is I like to think about like, okay, what are some things that are making me stop these days? What are some things that I'm really liking at the moment? And how might I be able to use that in a way that makes sense for my brand? So, if you go back to like video content, like, TikTok and Reels, I might look at like, okay, is it, maybe music? Like music informs your brand feel as well too, right? Choosing one song over another for the same video would have a completely different experience. You might mix up things like your messaging in terms of your video content. And then whether you're using, like when you're talking about, are you going to use videos of yourself or like, images, or maybe some videos that you take very simply with your phone and things like that. And so I like to just think about things that I'm seeing at the moment that make me stop personally, and how I might be able to weave that into my brand in a way that, would be quite interesting for my audience, but also delivering that same value. But it's the same as that whole repurposing content. We're always talking about repurposing content, and repurposing it in different mediums keeps things interesting. So if you think about like Instagram, for example, whether you think about someone's Instagram grid or their stories or their reels, mixing it up, like having a mix of videos versus images versus things like graphics that maybe show quotes, or maybe it's like graphics that show visual testimonials from people, then mixing it up with more professional videos versus more DIY on your phone videos. That's always a good thing. And then utilizing what's available on the platform on something like Instagram, whether you're using like your stickers or asking your questions and using your images as different backgrounds, like all those kinds of things, you're essentially repurposing the same content, but playing around with different visuals and then mixing it up. And I think that is one of those ways to sort of keep it interesting for your brand, especially on the platforms where you're spending a lot of time engaging with people and trying to, drive traffic to things like your website, or drive traffic to your contact form for people to actually book calls with you, things like that. So rather than doing the same thing all the time, just playing around with it and experimenting, I think is a really great way, especially because I think at the end of the day, building a brand is like this one huge experiment. We're always constantly testing things out and seeing what resonates with your audience. And that's a key thing as well, too, I think, making sure that, you experiment and see, okay, this works. This is kind of getting a lot of traction with, let's do more of that as well, too.
I agree. And I think for those of us that still might need a little bit of help, I think they should know that if you guys go to sandrachau.com, there's so much there in terms of resources for you. There's downloadable guides and cheat sheets in terms of, like, one of them is how to, 6 must-have images for your brand. If you guys are looking for, some more specific advice, you have some of that. And there's even a full training that they can go through. Can you tell them, like, if someone's working with you, how do you, like, where do you send them? What are you teaching these days? How do you help people that are in this space?
Yeah, so mainly, the School of Visual Branding, it specializes in teaching entrepreneurs how to, create brands that sell through consistent and elevated visuals. So that whether it's your images down to your video content, all those kind of different brand touch points that we mentioned throughout this podcast. And I think the starting point, that cheat sheet, is a really, really great way because it gives you that quick 5 to 6 ideas of things that you might be able to work for, that will work for your brand. And it's good for particularly service-based businesses, because I do find when it comes to creating visuals, when you have a service and not like a product to sell, it's a little bit more obscure. And so inside the cheat sheet, there's a few little things that you can do simply with your phone. And so it's very easy to put together a few different kind of visuals and different kinds of images that you can use across, whether it's for your website, Instagram, Pinterest, anything like that, wherever you want to show up for your brand. So that's probably a really good starting point, I think, for people as well, too, who wants to dig into their visuals a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And all that'll be linked up on the website if you guys, and in the show notes if you guys are interested. The course is called the Branding Shoot Method, and that's all at the schoolofvisualbranding.com, or everything is at sandrachau.com, CHAU.com. And you can easily find that. Now, if people want to tap into their creativity kind of themselves, what's your kind of tips on how to access some of that creativity, how to be confident in a kind of a creative space? Any tips for our listeners out there?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I really think one of my mantras is, progress over perfection, especially these days where there's so much required of us, as a business owner. And things are constantly changing. Like there's always like some new thing where you feel like you need to be in. But I think one of the things is, not so much thinking about all the different places that you need to be, but thinking about where your customers are at, where they probably spend their time, and focus on those one to two things rather being in all the places. And then also just making a point of like just showing up and testing things out. I think when you wait for things, like you wait for that professional photo shoot, or you wait for someone to be around to, help you create a reel, all of that will just stop you. Whereas I think these days where, there's a lot of focus on not so much that kind of perfect, pretty, everything needs to be like all, beautiful and whatnot. Like that's kind of not really the stage we're at. It's like the perfect stage for you to just show up and play around. And honestly, and this is, anybody who's a parent out there, you'll think about, you always tell your kids, like, practice makes perfect, practice. But we never do that for ourselves. We always think like, okay, it just needs to be perfect when we put something out there. And then that, breeds confidence. But a lot of the times the confidence comes from putting yourself out there, testing things out, and really just practicing it. And I think with that, if you just get more confident and more confident. And so that's probably like the biggest thing, I think, especially when we have to be in so many different places, is to just really have fun with it. There's no right or wrong way to do it. And I think a lot of the times, you actually understanding your brand and getting to know what you love and don't love, what works and what doesn't work, what resonates or what feels on brand. It all comes with actually just putting it out there and also just practicing and playing around with it. And that, once you get more familiar with that, that in turn, just slowly builds that confidence. So I think, progress over perfection, guys.
Absolutely. And, I've hired some photographers here or there for some personal branding photography. And after some uncomfortable moments, what I realized is the photos themselves, they don't have to be these very super aspirational type images. Like they just have to be professional photos. And it could be in me in an environment where I'm being super authentic and I'm being super, in my element, but the pictures themselves are just higher quality and taken from like angles I wouldn't have thought of, with, that, didn't catch me with a weird side angle, like at a Christmas, whatever it is, like,
Yeah.
trying to take a selfie. You can be completely authentic. And, because I know everyone's looking for like the real, right? They're not trying to be like, fake and, photoshopped, but you can have a great looking image in a very real environment, just, walking around your neighborhood or in your house or whatever it might be, and be real. So I appreciate those tips, because that's what it made me think of is, I can be myself. I don't have to be this fake version of it, but still hire a professional to make it look better than just my I can do on my cell phone because of bad lighting, bad angles. And,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why there's no right or wrong way. I think it's important to show up in a way that makes sense for your brand, in a way that is what's the word? It's something that you can continue doing for yourself. Because if you just try and, show up or look like, that other person who's doing something very similar to you or has a similar offering to you, what's going to set you apart? It's not, there's nothing that's really going to set you apart. And so I think the thing is and it's also not going to be something that you can keep up, I think, essentially. Because again, you could show up like that online, but then, if you have a service of some kind of offering, what happens when people meet you and it's not the same? You want to show up in a way that's authentic to yourself. And ultimately, I think that's the thing when you're thinking about branding, and just channeling that through all the different little bits that form your entire brand.
yeah, absolutely. Well, as we're kind of coming towards the end here, I'd like to hear kind of what are you excited about in the future for you or for visual branding in general?
Well, for me, like I love my agency work, and that's something that I really want to continue building. In the last couple of years with COVID, that kind of stalled a little bit, but this year, oh, not this year, actually, last year, with things going back to normal, it was really exciting to be able to work with clients again in that kind of capacity. So I really look forward to continue building that. And then also just with the school, I just really want to share all of this with as many brands as we can. And so that's something that I'm going to be looking forward to continuing building this year as well, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Any parting thoughts for our listeners? Any final thoughts, lessons that you didn't get to share today?
No, I just think, get out there and practice and I essentially think everyone has it. It's a matter of really, putting yourself out there and really thinking about your brand and, having fun with it, I think is ultimately the thing.
Absolutely. And if you guys want to hear more, you can always catch Sandra on her Instagram channel at Sandra Chau Design, or just go to the website, sandrachau.com, and also the schoolofvisualbranding.com. Sandra, thanks for sharing all your tips with us today. I've personally been taking notes, and I appreciate you helping me think about this stuff a little more intentionally than I have been. So appreciate you and your time today.
No, thanks so much, Brandon. Thanks so much for having me and for allowing me to share all of this with your audience as well.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening and checking in with us, being a part of our journey. We hope that you have taken something away today that you can implement tomorrow in your business to get you moving. And as always, we will catch you next time.
You've just taken your marketing knowledge to another level with this episode of Brands on Brands. But we have plenty more ways to help you build a brand that matters. Head over to brandsonbrands.com for resources, as well as access to our blogs, videos, and exclusive coaching sessions with your host. Be sure to visit brandsonbrands.com.